Greetings, travelers of the void. You have entered the domain of the void-born terrors. I have brought you monsters before. Things that whispered, things that waited, things that wore the faces of the people you loved. Tonight I bring you something rarer, and, I think, worse. Because tonight the monsters are not the horror. Tonight the horror is what it costs to be good in a galaxy that has no use for it. 900 meters under a dying hive city, on a world of ash and fire, 31 human beings were saved by 7 of the most compassionate warriors the Imperium of man has ever forged. Every single one of those 31 survivors would tell you afterward, in the small hours when the shaking started, that they had never in their lives been so afraid of anything as they were of the things that came to rescue them. 8 feet tall, skin like cooled slag, black as the inside of a furnace, eyes that burned red in the dark and did not blink and did not close, armor hung with drake scale, moving through smoke that smelled of sulfur and hot iron. They came down into the dark to save those people. They meant it. It is the only thing in this whole story that anyone meant purely, and it killed almost everyone. Listen close, traveler, and when the fire goes up, watch what it shows you. And remember that the dark comes back every time and comes back deeper. Chapter 1. The Descent into the Ash. The world was called Kolvath, and it had been burning quietly for 11,000 years. Not a war burning, a geological one. Kolvath was a volcanic world, tectonically furious, a cracked black ball of basalt and ash, whose crust had never once settled. And the only reason the Imperium had ever come to it was that its restlessness had pushed a great many useful things close to the surface. Ferrum ore, sulfur, rare heavy metals that could be scooped out of magma channels by anyone willing to work close enough to the heat. And so, in the way of the Imperium, a hive had been built on top of it. Hive Vantor, 40 kilometers of stacked rockcrete and iron wrapped down into the crust like a nail into a burn. And 11 million people had been put inside it and told to dig. The digging was done in the Deepworks. That is where this story happens. And you have to feel the place before you can feel what happened in it. 900 meters below the lowest hab level of Hive Vantor, a warren of galleries and drift tunnels and pump halls and access shafts ran out for kilometers through hot rock, following the ore. The ambient temperature down there was 60 degrees and climbing. The air was thick with ash and rock dust and the sulfur stink that came up out of every fissure, so that the workers wore rebreathers by law and cheap ashcloth by custom, and coughed themselves grey by 50. There was no natural light. There had never been any natural light. There were lumen strings strung along the tunnel roofs, running off the same geothermal grid that ran everything else on Kolvath. A vast old Mechanicus exchange tapped straight into a magma chamber that the workers called the Cauldron. The Cauldron had been failing for 6 days. Orla Vey was a duct runner, which was the lowest and strangest trade in the Deepworks, and the reason she is alive to be in this account. The ventilation network that kept the Deepworks breathable was a labyrinth in its own right. Thousands of kilometers of ducting, some of it a meter wide, some of it barely wide enough for a body, threaded through the rock between the galleries. And it clogged constantly with ash and rock dust and worse, and somebody had to go in and clear it. Machines could not do it. The ducts were too narrow and too irregular, and 400 years of patchwork had made them a chart no one had ever finished drawing. So they used people, small people, people who did not panic in the dark, in an enclosed space with rock above them and rock below them, and no room to turn around. Orla had been doing it for 19 years, since she was 12. She was 31 and small, and she had a duct runner's particular kind of nerve, which is not courage as anyone else understands it, but simply a very high tolerance for being somewhere no one would ever find your body. She knew the ventilation network of the Deepworks better than any living person, which on the 22nd day of that month made her the least important worker on the level, and on the 23rd day made her the most important human being on Kolvath. Her father was called Kasem, and he was 68, and he had worked the drift faces for 40 years before the ash took his lungs, and he could not walk 50 meters without stopping. He should not have been in the Deepworks at all. There was no provision for the retired in Hive Vantor beyond a ration chit and a corner, and Orla had done what half the Deepworks did with their old. Brought him down, put him on the pump hall roster as a valve watcher, a job that a man could do sitting down, and let the foreman skim a cut of her credit for the paperwork. He sat in a chair by the number 4 cistern and watched a gauge and coughed. He had a good chair. She had traded 3 months of ration credit for the chair. I tell you about the chair because the chair is the whole story. Everything that happens from here happens because a woman would not leave a man in a chair. The cauldron began to fail on the 17th. First it was surges, the lumen strings browning out down the galleries, coming back, browning again. Then it was heat. The deep sections went from 60 to 70 to 78, and the Mechanicus adepts came down in their red robes and went away again without saying anything to anyone, which is what Mechanicus adepts do when a thing is going badly. Then, on the 20th, the pumps started to stutter, and when the pumps stutter in a place like the Deepworks, it is not about water, it is about air. The whole ventilation system ran off the cauldron. If the cauldron went, the air went. And 900 meters down the air does not simply get stale. It gets hot, and it fills with sulfur, and the ash settles out of the moving column and comes down on everything like grey snow. And after a while you stop breathing. They did not evacuate. Of course they did not evacuate. There were 19,000 workers on the Deepworks rosters, and the lifting capacity to move perhaps 400 an hour. And Hive Vantor's administrators had a quota and a schedule and no instructions. And so what they did, what such men always do, was issue a notice reassuring everyone that the situation was in hand, and keep the shifts running, and wait for somebody senior enough to make a decision to make one. On the 22nd day, something else came into the Deepworks. Nobody saw it come. Nobody ever does. That is the entire evolutionary point of the thing, and the Imperium's own tactici manuals, in the sections that are not widely circulated, are very clear on the matter. What the Deepworks experienced was not an attack, it was an absence. Shift 9 did not come up. That was all. 206 workers went down the number 7 drift at the change of shift, and none of them came back, and the vox from the number 7 face went to static. And when the foreman sent a party down to see, the party did not come back either. There was no blood. That was the thing that ran through the galleries faster than any siren. The second party, 12 men with cutting gear and shotguns from the enforcer locker, went down number 7 and found the shift's tools laid out at the face, and the lumen strings still burning, and the ore cars half loaded, and 206 sets of rebreather masks on the ground in a rough line, as though everybody had stopped at the same moment and taken them off, and nothing else. No bodies, no blood on the rock, nothing on the floor but the masks and a fine, tacky residue on the tunnel roof that nobody could identify, and that everybody, without discussing it, stopped standing underneath. What the Deepworks did about it in those 2 days is worth recording, because it is what any industrial population does, and because it is why so many died. They kept working. Not all of them. The lower drifts emptied fast. But the mid-levels ran shifts right through the 22nd, And the reason is not stupidity. It is that Hive Vantor paid by the shift, and a worker who did not present at the muster board did not eat. And there was no mechanism anywhere in the administration of that hive for a man to say, "I am not going down today because people are disappearing," and still feed his family. The foreman had no authority to halt. The administratum had no procedure. So 19,000 people conducted a slow, private negotiation with their own fear, one shift at a time, and a great many of them lost it and went down and did not come up. The disappearances themselves had a pattern that the workforce read long before anyone official did. It took the ones who were alone. Not always. Shift 9 had been 206 together, but overwhelmingly, in those first 2 days, it took the man who went back for a tool, the pair who split at a junction, the sump crew of 3. So the Deepworks invented overnight, without any instruction, a rule that spread through 19,000 people, faster than any notice. Nobody walks anywhere alone. People went to the latrines in 4s. Shift crews slept in heaps in the galleries rather than return to the hab lifts. And it worked more or less, which is how a workforce with no weapons and no information and no help bought itself 36 hours by pure collective instinct. It is also, in the flat cruelty of it, exactly what the thing in the tunnels wanted. A population that clumps is a population that has gathered itself into a small number of known locations. By the 23rd, the Deepworks had helpfully sorted itself into 11 or 12 big frightened crowds, all stationary, all easy to find, and the harvesting stopped being individual and started being wholesale. By the 23rd, 4,000 workers were unaccounted for. The lower galleries were dark, the lumen strings there having failed or been snuffed, nobody knew which, and the workforce of the Deepworks had stopped being a workforce and become a crowd. And a crowd 900 meters underground, in 78 degrees of heat, with the air thinning and something in the dark, taking people quietly and completely, is not a thing that lasts long as a crowd. Orla got her father out of the pump hall and into the number 4 cistern bunker with about 40 others, and they welded the door. Now let me take you up to the surface, to the landing apron on the shoulder of Hive Vantor, where the ash fell like grey snow, and a Thunderhawk gunship had just come down out of a sky the color of an old bruise. Because at the same hour that a duct runner was welding a bunker door, 7 of the Emperor's angels were being handed the worst orders they had ever received. There were 7 of them. That is a small number, and it is a canonical one. The chapter they belong to has been understrength since a betrayal 10,000 years old, and they do not have men to spare, and they are spread across the segmentum in 10s and 20s, where other chapters deploy in companies. 7 salamanders of the Adeptus Astartes, detached from a war 3 systems away, sent to Kolvath because Kolvath's geothermal core was about to fail catastrophically, and the Mechanicus had calculated what that would do. I should tell you what they were. It matters enormously to everything that follows. They were sons of Vulcan, of the 18th Legion, born or made on a world called Nocturne, a volcanic death world worse than Kolvath by an order of magnitude, a place whose own moon comes so close on its orbit that the tides tear the crust open and the whole population must go into the mountains to survive it, over and over, forever. That is where these men come from, a world that tries to kill everybody on it every few years, where survival is a communal act and no one gets through alone. And out of that world came a chapter unlike any other in the Imperium. Warriors who are also smiths, every one of them, who forge their own armor and weapons with their own hands, who live among the people of their world rather than above them, who have kin, who are known by name in the towns they came from, and who hold, as the deepest article of their creed, a thing that most of the Imperium finds either quaint or dangerous. That the purpose of a warrior is the protection of the ordinary human being, and that this purpose does not have exceptions in it. Their creed is called the Promethean cult. Their oath, spoken over the anvil, is that they will stand between mankind and the fire, not most of mankind, not mankind in the aggregate, having regard to strategic priority, mankind, the ones in front of you, and their bodies are wrong. That is the last thing, and it is the thing the miners saw first. Something in the interaction between Nocturne's radiation and their gene seed turns them, over the years, into something the rest of the species finds difficult to look at. Skin gone coal black, black as slag, black as the inside of a furnace, and eyes that lose all pigment and go a deep burning red, red as a banked coal, and shine in the dark, because the ocular structures behind them are built to see heat. 8 feet of that, in ceramite, hung with the scaled hides of things they killed on their homeworld, moving in a haze of its own waste heat, smelling of promethium and hot metal and sulfur. The most humane creatures in the Imperium of man look exactly like devils. Vulcan's sons have carried that joke for 10,000 years. On Kolvath, on the 23rd day, it stopped being funny. Their sergeant's name was Locke. He was not a poetic man. His squad brothers would have told you he was the least imaginative salamander any of them had served under, and they would have meant it as praise. Locke's gift was that he did the arithmetic, and then did what the arithmetic said, and he had brought more brothers home than sergeants twice his tenure. He listened to the Mechanicus Magos on the landing apron for 4 minutes and asked 3 questions and understood the whole shape of it. The cauldron was going to breach, not fail, breach. The geothermal exchange was tapped directly into a magma chamber, and the containment was going. And when it went, the chamber would vent upward through the exchange and up the main shafts, and 40 kilometers of stacked hive with 11 million people in it would become a chimney. The Mechanicus estimate for total loss of Hive Vantor was between 9 and 11 million. There was one way to prevent it. The deep blast gates below the exchange, 4 of them, ancient and enormous, could be closed and sealed, which would cap the vent and force the pressure sideways into the dead galleries. The gates had to be closed manually from the gatehouse at the bottom of the primary shaft, because the cauldron's own failing grid ran the remote actuators, and the cauldron's own failing grid was the problem. 11 million lives, 1 gatehouse, 900 meters down. Time, Locke said. 6 hours, the Magos told him. Perhaps 7. After that, the containment failed regardless of what anyone did. Opposition. And here the Magos hesitated in a way that Locke, who had been fighting for 200 years, disliked immediately. There were, the Magos said, reports of industrial disorder in the lower galleries, losses of personnel, loss of contact with 4,000 workers, almost certainly panic, sabotage, the usual behavior of a workforce under stress. Almost certainly, Locke said. The Magos said nothing. Bodies, said Locke. The Magos said that no bodies had been recovered. Locke looked at him for a moment with those banked coal eyes, and then he turned and gave his brothers the only briefing he gave that day. And it was 4 sentences long, and I record it here because it is the last moment in this story when anybody thought they understood what was happening. Primary shaft all the way down. Close the gates. 6 hours. A pause. Something is eating the workforce, and the Mechanicus does not want to say the word. Go in expecting the word. They went down at the 4th hour past the ash noon, 7 of them, into a shaft 900 meters deep, in the dark. The lifts were dead. They went down the maintenance stair. A spiral of iron grating bolted to the shaft wall. 4,000 steps, built for men a third their size. And it took them 50 minutes, and with every 100 meters the temperature climbed, and the ash thickened, and the light from the surface shrank to a grey coin, and then to nothing at all. Their armor's autosenses shifted over into thermal, and the world became a false color thing of heat, the rock walls glowing, the air above the fissures shimmering, and each other, 7 furnace shapes descending in a line. Brother Kajen, who carried the heavy flamer, said, at the 600-meter mark, "No vermin." He was right, and it was the first true sign. A place like the Deepworks is thick with life at the edges of it. Rats, ash flies, the pale things that live in the sumps. 900 meters of shaft, and they saw nothing alive, not one thing. And Brother Shakur said what all of them were thinking, in the flat way of a man who wants to be told he is wrong. Something's been through. I should tell you what those 7 were carrying down that stair, because a salamander's war gear is not issued to him, and it matters to the ending. Every one of them had made it. That is not a figure of speech, and it is not ceremonial. On Nocturne, a warrior of the 18th is apprenticed to the forge before he is apprenticed to the bolter, and he does not receive his war plate. He builds it over years at an anvil with his own hands and repairs it himself for the rest of his life, and the ornamentation on it is his own work and means something to him personally. Kajan's heavy flamer had a fuel line housing he had reforged 4 times because he did not like the balance. Shakur's thunderhammer had a haft of black iron with a spiral chased into it that he had cut himself at 20 and never explained to anyone. The drake scale on their shoulders came from things they had personally killed on their homeworld as part of becoming what they were. This is why the Salamanders are the only chapter in the Imperium that treats its equipment the way a craftsman treats his tools rather than the way a soldier treats his kit. And it is also, if you want the plain grimdark of it, why they are perpetually under strength and always will be. They cannot mass produce themselves. Everything about them, from the plate to the doctrine to the vow, is handmade, slow, and impossible to scale in an Imperium that runs on scale. 7 handmade men went down 4,000 steps into the dark of Kolvath. There were, at that moment, perhaps 900 of their chapter alive in the entire galaxy. They reached the bottom of the primary shaft at the 51st minute and stepped off the stair into the great transfer gallery of the Deepworks and found the slaughterhouse. It was not what any of them expected, and Locke had expected a great deal. There was no carnage. There were no bodies. The transfer gallery was a vaulted space 200 meters long, big enough for ore trains, and it was empty, and it was silent, and it was hung. From the roof, from the gantries, from the cable runs, with cocoons. That is the only word for what they were, and no one has ever found a better one. Long bundled shapes, 3 meters and more, wrapped in a grey-white fibrous matter that had been extruded rather than woven, hanging in clusters of 6 and 8 from the gallery roof. Hundreds of them, all down the length of the vault. Some still moved, not many. Enough. Brother Ndoro, who was the youngest of them, and who had been on Kolvath for 2 hours, raised his lamp, a real lamp, a flood, white light, and swept it up along the roof, and the 7 of them stood in absolute silence and looked at 4,000 missing workers. And Locke, who was not a poetic man, said the word that the Mechanicus Magos had not wanted to say. Tyranids. He said it flatly, and the flatness of it was the most frightening thing his squad had ever heard from him, because they all knew what it meant. Not that there were Xenos in the Deepworks, Xenos they could kill. It meant Vanguard. It meant that these were the advanced organisms, the infiltrators, the ones that come first, that go quietly into a world weeks or months ahead of everything else, and hunt, and harvest, and learn, and mark. It meant that something very much larger was already on its way to Kolvath, and would arrive when it was ready. And it meant, though none of them said it, that whatever they did in the next 6 hours would not save this world. It would only decide how many of its people were alive to watch it end. They were still standing under the cocoons when the Vox in Locke's helm caught a signal. Weak, local, a maintenance channel bouncing badly off 900 meters of hot rock. And a human voice came into that dead gallery, cracked and thin and utterly exhausted, repeating a phrase it had clearly been repeating for a very long time to nobody at all. Cistern 4, 41 souls. We have a sealed door and we are running out of air. Is there anyone? Is there anyone? Is there anyone? Locke closed his eyes. 6 hours, 900 meters, 1 gatehouse, 11 million lives, and 41 people behind a door in the wrong direction. His brothers were watching him. They knew what he was going to say. Every one of them knew, because every one of them had spoken the same oath over the same anvil. And there had never been a moment's doubt in the whole history of their chapter about what that oath required. And that is precisely the horror I have brought you here to see. There is one more thing about that moment under the cocoons, and it is the thing I have been building toward since the prologue. Locke did not ask his brothers. He did not put it to them, did not weigh it aloud, did not consult. And it was not arrogance. Locke consulted his squad constantly, on everything, all night. He did not consult them on this one because there was nothing to consult about. 6 other men were standing in that gallery, and every one of them had already turned toward the sound of the Vox before the sergeant spoke, and Locke knew they had, and they knew he knew. That is the part outsiders never quite believe about the sons of Vulcan, and it is why other chapters find them by turns admirable and exasperating, and in a few recorded cases, actively dangerous to operate alongside. Their compassion is not a virtue they exercise. It is not a decision they make well under pressure. It is load-bearing structure. It is welded into the doctrine at a level below choice, the way a reflex sits below thought, and it fires whether or not the arithmetic supports it. Which means that a salamander squad in a corridor with a dying stranger in it is, functionally, a squad that has already committed before anybody has said a word. An ultramarine would have run the numbers. An Imperial fist would have held the gatehouse and been right. A son of Dawn or Gilliman would have logged those 41 souls as an acceptable loss and never lost an hour's sleep, and 11 million people would have been saved with a comfortable margin. And every chapter in the Imperium would have called that the correct operation, and it would have been the correct operation. 7 men went to the cistern instead, because they were made on a world where the whole population goes into the mountains together or nobody comes out, and where the first thing a child learns is that you do not leave. Cistern 4, said Sergeant Locke. Move. Chapter 2. What came through the door? 41 people had been behind that door for 31 hours. Orla had counted the first 12 of them and then stopped counting, because counting hours in the dark is a way of hurting yourself, and because by then there had been more urgent arithmetic. The cistern bunker was a rockcrete box 11 meters by 8, built to house pumping machinery that had been stripped out a century ago, with one door of 40mm plate and one dead ventilation register in the ceiling, and no other opening at all. 41 people, 11 by 8. The air had gone bad on the second night. You do not in that situation notice suffocation the way you imagine you would. There is no dramatic gasping. What happens is that people get stupid. The headache comes first, a deep dull band across the front of the skull, and then the strange lassitude, and then people start making small errors of judgment and getting angry about them, and then the children stop crying, which everyone in that room mistook for a mercy for about an hour before somebody understood it was not. And then, very gradually, people begin to sit down and not get up. Orla had cracked the ventilation register open with a bar on the second night and got a thin, dirty draft that smelled of sulfur and had probably bought them all 6 hours. It had also, she understood perfectly well, given whatever was in the tunnels a hole to listen through. Her father was on the floor against the back wall with his head on her rolled ash cloth, and his breathing had gone shallow and fast, and every 20 minutes or so he surfaced enough to say something. "Should have left me at the cistern, girl." "Shut up, Dar." I'd have watched the gauge. A long, wet, effortful pause. I'd have watched it right to the end. Good chair, that. There was a man called Hesh in that bunker, a drift foreman, 40-odd, hard-handed, and not a cruel man. And it was Hesh who said the thing out loud on the second night that everyone in the room had privately thought. He did not say it to be cruel. He said it because he was a foreman, and foremen do arithmetic out loud. He said, 41 people and air for maybe 30. There's 6 or 7 in here who won't walk out under their own power regardless. If they were somewhere else, the rest of us have a chance. And nobody agreed with him. And nobody argued with him either. And the silence after he said it was the worst thing that happened in that bunker in 31 hours. And Orla Vey lay awake in the dark afterward, with her hand on her father's chest, counting his breaths. They had heard things at the door twice before. That is the context you need for what the melting plate did to that room. On the first night, something had come down the tunnel outside, and stopped, and stayed, for a length of time that Orla estimated at 40 minutes, and that was probably 11. And in all that time it made almost no sound. Just, occasionally, a soft dragging touch along the outside of the plate, at about head height, moving slowly from one side of the door to the other, and back. Testing, reading. 41 people stood in absolute silence in the dark, and listened to something run its hand across the only thing between them and it. And on the second night, the Vox had come alive. The bunker had a wall set, an old maintenance unit, and it had been dead since they welded the door, and on the second night, it crackled and produced a voice. It was a woman's voice. It said quite clearly, "Is anyone in there? Please, please, I can't find the way back." And a man in that bunker recognized it as his sister's, and got as far as the door with his hands on the seals, before 4 other men brought him down and sat on him, and he fought them, and wept, and called them murderers. And the voice went on for some while, saying the same 4 sentences, always the same 4, in the same order, with the same intonation, over and over. Orla killed the wall set with a bar. Nobody argued. She never learned what it was. The Imperium's files on Lichter's note, in the flat language such files use, that the organism's feeder tendrils extract the neural content of prey, and that captured vocal patterning is occasionally reproduced in the field. That is one explanation. What it meant in a rockcrete box on the second night was that whatever was outside had taken somebody's sister, and had learned her, and had come to the door and used her, and had been genuinely, nearly successful. So when the door began to glow on the 31st hour, nobody in that bunker thought rescue. Every soul in the room had 2 solid data points about what was on the other side of that plate, and both of them were the same thing, and it had been patient with them twice, and had now, apparently, decided to stop being patient. Then, at the 31st hour, the door started to glow. It began as a dull cherry point in the middle of the plate, and it spread outward, and the rockcrete around the frame started to sprawl and crack with sharp sounds like gunshots, and the air in the bunker, which was already unbreathable, filled with the smell of scorching metal. And 41 people who had spent 31 hours listening to things move in the tunnels outside pressed themselves against the back wall and understood that it had finally come for them. Somebody was praying. Somebody was screaming. Hesh had got a cutting bar up in both hands, which was brave and completely pointless. Orla had put herself between the door and her father, which was equally pointless, and she has never been able to explain why she did it and has never once regretted it. The plate went white in a ring the width of a man and sagged and fell inward and hit the floor, and 40 centimeters of hardened plasteel rang like a bell on the rockcrete, and smoke poured in through the hole, grey, hot, stinking of sulfur, and a shape came through it. Now I want to be very careful here, because this is the beat the whole story turns on, and if I tell it the way it is usually told, I will tell you a lie. The usual telling goes, and then the Emperor's angels came, and the people wept with joy. That is how the ecclesiarchy renders it on the devotional plates, and it is how every hive child in the Imperium is taught to imagine it, and it is not what happened in the cistern bunker on Kolvath. What came through the hole was 8 feet tall, and had to turn its shoulders to get in. Its skin was black, not brown, not dark, black, the flat, lightless black of cooled slag, and in the glow of the still molten door edge, you could see that the black went right up over the skull, and there was no hair anywhere on it. It wore ceramite plate the color of a dark forest, under a great deal of ash and soot, and over the plate, at the shoulder and hip, were scales, actual scales, hand-sized, overlapping, from something that had been alive. It carried in one hand a weapon with a pilot flame burning at the muzzle, and the pilot flame was the only clean light in the room. It was radiating heat. You could feel it across 11 meters, a wall of it, the way you feel a furnace door open. And its eyes were red, not reflecting red, lit. 2 coals in a black face, and they moved, and they found every living thing in that room in about a second and a half, and they did not blink. The lenses of a salamander's helm glow because of what is behind them. Their ocular implants run hot and run on thermal, and the optics bleed a dull red back out through the lens housing, and there is no way to switch it off, and no reason any salamander has ever wanted to. On a battlefield, it is a warning. In a lightless rockcrete box at the 31st hour, it is 2 burning points in a black shape that fills the doorway, and the human eye, which has evolved over a very long time to have extremely strong opinions about eyeshine in the dark, does not consult the intellect before it decides what it is looking at. And under it all, filling the room, driving people back against the wall, as much as the sight of him, the heat and the smell. Ceramite that has run a thermal load through 900 meters of hot rock radiates like a stove. The miners nearest the door were physically burned by proximity within a minute, mild, blistering, and did not notice until much later. And the smell that came off the squad was promethium and scorched metal, and, under those, sulfur. The sulfur of Kolvath's own fissures, baked into their plate on the way down. So, something enormous, black, radiating heat, stinking of brimstone, with burning eyes, standing in the wreckage of the door it had just melted open, in a hole in the ground. There is a very old word for that image. Every human culture that ever built a furnace has some version of it. And 31 hours of suffocating dark had stripped 41 people back to the part of the mind where that word lives. Nobody wept with joy. A woman near the door lost consciousness, simply dropped, the way people do. 2 men began to scream and could not stop. Somebody at the back was saying no, 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 no on a rising note. Hesh, to his eternal credit and to no purpose whatsoever, swung the cutting bar, and the thing in the doorway took it out of his hands with a motion too fast to follow and set it down on the floor, carefully, as though it were worried about breaking it. And Orla Vey, 31 years old, standing in front of her father with nothing in her hands at all, looked up into a black face with burning eyes 8 feet above her, and had the single clearest thought of her entire life, which was, this is what was in the tunnels. It was never anything else. We have been hiding from this. Then it spoke, and the voice came out of the smoke like something dragged over gravel, and what it said was, do not run. Nobody ran. Nobody could have run. It stepped through and to the side, and a second one came through the hole behind it, and a third, and the bunker, which had held 41 people in 11 meters by 8, now held 41 people and 3 armored giants, and there was no space left anywhere, and the heat of them was appalling. The first one crouched. That is the detail Orla told the administratum scribes afterward, and that they did not write down, and it is the detail I would like you to keep. The thing crouched down onto one knee so that its head was no longer above hers, and it did this deliberately, the way you would crouch to speak to a child, and it said again, more slowly, do not run. We are the Emperor's angels of death. We have come to take you up. And a man at the back of that bunker, Orla never learned his name, he did not survive the night, said in a high, cracked voice, the sentence that Sergeant Locke would carry with him into the fire 6 hours later. You look like the things that took them. There was a pause then in that hot black room that went on for perhaps 2 full seconds. Then the giant reached up and unsealed its helm. It had been wearing a helm, Orla realized. That was the helm, and the black face and burning eyes had been underneath it all along, and there was a hiss of overpressure, and it lifted the helmet clear. The face beneath was worse, that is the truth, and I will not soften it. The helm had at least been a machine, and a human mind can file a machine. What came out from under it was a face with an expression on it, with lines at the eyes, with a mouth that had clearly spent a lifetime doing the things mouths do, and it was black as slag and crisscrossed with old burn scarring, and the eyes in it were coals. And the awful thing, the thing that broke 2 more people in that room, was that it was kind. You could see kindness in it. You could see, plainly, that this creature was troubled by their fear and was trying to fix it, and no part of the human animal is equipped to be looked at with kindness by something that looks like that. In the dark, in the smoke, 900 meters underground. My name is Locke, it said. I was born on a world that burns, as you were. I have a mother, and she is alive, and her name is Yenna, and she keeps a smithy in a town called Eth. I am telling you this so that you will know that I am a man. He was not a poetic man. Every one of his brothers said so. That was the best he had, and he had thought of it on the run-down 4 galleries, and he offered it to 41 suffocating strangers in a rockcrete box, and roughly 1/3 of them believed him. I want to stop on that sentence, because it is the hinge of everything, and it deserves more than a passing line. A space marine does not usually have to do this. Across almost the whole Imperium, the Adeptus Astartes arrive among mortals who have been taught from infancy exactly what they are. The Emperor's angels, the finest thing humanity ever made, and who fall to their knees on sight. That is the normal transaction. The angel does not have to establish anything. The devotional plates did it 200 years before he landed. Even the ones who look strange, the ones with the wrong skin or the wrong eyes, arrive inside a story the population already knows by heart. And that transaction fails completely at 900 meters in the dark, at the 31st hour, in front of people who have spent 2 nights listening to something patient run its hand along their door. Down there the story is gone. Down there you're simply an 8-foot thing with burning eyes that has cut open the last barrier between these people and the dark. And every instinct the species has spent 1,000,000 years developing is screaming a single syllable at them, and it is not Savior. So he told them his mother's name. That is what a salamander does when the story fails. He does not invoke the Emperor, or his chapter, or his rank. He reaches for the only currency that works between one human being and another when everything else has burned away. And he says, I have a mother. She is alive. She is a smith. This is where she lives. He offered them the one thing an angel of death is not supposed to have, which is a private life, and he offered it as evidence. 1/3 of them believed him. Bear that number in mind for the rest of this account, because it never really went above 1/3, not in 8 hours, not through everything that followed. He would spend the entire night, and in the end, his life, on a crowd that was 2/3 certain he was a monster right up until the moment the fire took him. And he never once, by any account, seemed to find that unreasonable. There is a door out of the deeps, said Locke. We will take you to it. You will do exactly as I say, and you will not stop, and you will not make noise. Can you all walk? And the room, 41 people, 28 of whom could walk unaided, went very quiet. And Orleve felt every eye in that bunker come to rest, without a single word being spoken, on the old man on the floor behind her. Here is where I must step out of the tunnel for a moment and explain the trap. Because if you do not understand the trap, you will spend this whole story wanting to shout at these people. Sergeant Locke had 6 hours when he stood under the cocoons. By the time the cistern door fell in, he had 4.5. The gatehouse was at the base of the primary shaft. That is, back the way they had come. 3 galleries and 1,100 meters of tunnel behind them. And the surface, the only place these civilians could actually be taken, was 900 meters straight up a stair that Locke's squad had descended in 50 minutes, and that a column of oxygen-starved miners, including several who could not stand, would not manage in 4. There was no version of the next 4 hours in which Locke saved these people and closed the gates. He knew that in the doorway. He had known it before the plate hit the floor. The arithmetic was not difficult, and Locke's entire gift was arithmetic. And he had gone to the door anyway because of a thing he swore over an anvil on a burning world a long time ago, and because the Promethean creed does not contain a clause about acceptable losses, and because this is the part the rest of the Imperium has never been able to forgive the sons of Vulcan for. Because in 200 years of war, he had never once been able to make himself do the other thing. So he stood in a bunker doorway with 4.5 hours left and 11 million people over his head. And he looked at an old man on the floor who could not walk, and he made the decision that killed his squad. Kajen, Shakor, you will carry those who cannot walk. Sergeant, said Kajen, the gates. I know where the gates are, brother. With respect, I know where the gates are. It came out of Locke like a furnace door opening, and the whole bunker flinched from it. And then he mastered it, and when he spoke again it was flat and level and quiet. And this is the line the survivors all remembered, every one of them, word for word, 40 years later. We came down here to keep 11 million people from burning. We will not begin by burning 41 of them to save time. He put his helm back on. The room, which had been staring at his face, discovered it preferred the helm. There is a detail from that bunker that did not seem important at the time, and became the most quoted line in the whole Kolvath record, among the handful of people who ever read it. As they were forming the column, a woman asked Locke whether the Emperor had sent them. She meant it simply. She was frightened, and she wanted the story back, the one from the devotional plates, the one where the angels come because he wills it. And Locke, who was busy, said, "No, Amagos sent us to close a gate." The woman said, "Then why are you here?" And the sergeant stopped what he was doing, which he had not done for anything else, and said, "Because you were on the way." He meant it literally. That is the terrible flatness of the man. There was no rhetoric in him anywhere. The cistern bunker was 3 galleries off the route to the primary shaft, and he had heard a Vox signal and gone to it because it was there and it was alive. That was the whole of the reasoning. No prophecy, no divine instruction, no grand design. A man on his way to do one thing heard people dying in a side tunnel and turned aside. And the turning aside cost 7 lives, and 11 million were saved anyway, and 31 people got out, and none of it was planned by anybody. "Up," said Locke. "Now." There was a thing Locke did before they moved, that Orla did not understand for years, and that I will give you now, because it is the only piece of tactical mercy in this entire account that actually worked. He had Urazan burn the bunker, not while they were in it. After. The last thing they did on leaving was to put a melter charge into the empty rockcrete box that had held 41 people for 31 hours and turn it into a glowing cavity. And the miners, filing away up the tunnel, looked back at the destruction of the only safe place they had known in 2 days, and several of them wept about it. And Hesh actually swore at Locke, out loud, to his face, which took a kind of nerve. Locke explained it exactly once, in 9 words, and did not explain it again. He said, "They can smell where you were, now they cannot." The pheromone trail. That is the piece of lictor biology that the Imperium does publish, in the manuals that get read by people who will never meet one. The organism lays a chemical marker on the ground it has surveyed and on the prey it has selected, and it is how the vanguard coordinates without ever being in the same tunnel, and it is why the bunker had been visited twice by 2 different things on 2 different nights. 31 hours of 41 frightened people breathing and sweating in a sealed box had made that room the loudest object in the Deepworks. He burned it, and the column went up the tunnel with the enemy's map of them a little less complete than it had been. And that decision is very probably why more than half of them were still alive at the rockfall 4 hours later. Nobody thanked him for it. It is difficult to thank someone for setting fire to your shelter, in the dark, while you cannot breathe. Orla worked it out at some point in the 2nd hour, and did not say anything, and by then there was nothing to say. They got them moving in 8 minutes. The Salamanders took the point and the rear. Brother Andoro, the youngest, picked up 2 children under one arm, as though they were rolled cloth, and did not appear to notice their weight. Shakor took Kasem Vey off the floor, with a gentleness that Orla found almost unbearable to watch, and the old man made a sound of protest, and Shakor said, "Be still, grandfather," in a voice like rocks going down a chute, and Kasem, who had argued with every foreman on Kolvath for 40 years, was still. They went out through the melted door into the black, and 40 meters up the tunnel at the first junction, while the column was still bunching and stumbling, and the salamanders were still counting heads, something came down out of the ceiling on a barbed line and took the woman at the back of the column. Took her upward, fast, without a sound, with her arms still down at her sides, and she was gone into the dark of a ventilation shaft before the scream that came out of her had finished leaving the tunnel. Chapter 3. The Suffocating March.
Here is what a lictor is, and I will give it to you plainly. because Orleve and the people of the Deepworks were never told and spent the rest of their lives not knowing what had hunted them. It is not a monster in the sense you mean. It is a tool, grown for a purpose, by an intelligence that grows tools the way a forge makes nails. When a Tyranid hive fleet approaches a world, it does not simply arrive.
It sends things ahead, down through the atmosphere in spores, weeks or months before, to land in the wild places and the deep places and begin work. And the finest of those advanced organisms, the apex of the vanguard, is the lictor. It is 4 meters of muscle and chitin that can stand in an open corridor and not be seen, because its carapace shifts color and texture to match whatever is behind it, and because it can hold absolutely still for hours. It absorbs sound. There is a reason nobody hears them. It carries, folded against its forelimbs, a cluster of barbed hooks on retractable cables, flesh hooks, for reaching into a space and taking a body out of it faster than the body can react. It has scything talons that open ceramite, and beneath its headplate, it has a nest of fine tendrils that it presses into the skull of what it kills, and through them it reads memory, knowledge, the layout of your tunnels, the location of your shelters, the names of your children, and passes all of it back to the fleet. They are not hunting for food. They are surveying. Every person taken out of the Deepworks was a report filed, and when the hive fleet finally arrived over Kolvath, it would arrive knowing the place better than the Mechanicus did. There were, the Imperium later assessed, somewhere between 4 and 9 of them in the Deepworks that night. Nobody has ever established the number, because nobody ever saw more than one at a time, and because the thing about a lictor is that you do not count them. You count what is missing. The column went up the drift tunnel at the speed of its slowest member, and its slowest member was a 68-year-old man with 2 ruined lungs being carried by a space marine, which is to say the column went at a fast walk, and a fast walk was catastrophically slow. They lost the second one at the 11-minute mark, a boy of 19 at the left flank, half a meter out of the line. And it was half a meter, Orla saw it. She was 4 bodies back, and there was a sound like a whip, and he simply was not there anymore. No struggle, no shout. Brother Urzan put a melter blast into the ceiling void where the hooks had come from, and the tunnel roof came down in a sheet of molten slag, and there was nothing in it. There never was. There is a thing that happens to a group of people being hunted like that, and it happened to the Deepworks column inside the first half hour, and it is not in any tactical manual, because it is not tactical. It is that everybody stops being able to be at the back. The column had 39 civilians in it when it left the bunker. Within 20 minutes it had compressed from a column into a clot, a dense, terrified mass jammed shoulder to shoulder in the middle of the tunnel, because every single person had independently worked out that the thing takes from the edges and had adjusted, and the adjustment of 39 people, all trying simultaneously to not be on the outside, produces a knot that cannot walk. People trod on each other. 2 people went down and were nearly trampled. Progress dropped to almost nothing, and progress was the only currency anyone had. Andoro fixed it, and the way he fixed it is the most human thing in this account. He walked the outside. He put himself on the left flank of the column and stayed there at the very edge, in the dark, alone for the entire march, the exposed side, the side the hooks came from, and he did not do it silently. He talked the whole way, in that deep gravel voice at conversational volume, about nothing, about the ore grades in the drift they were passing, about a forge town on Nocturne called Eth, where his sergeant's mother made cookpots, about the weather on a world none of them would ever see. It was not a speech, and it was not reassurance, and none of it meant anything. It was simply a large voice, continuously, on the dangerous side of the group, so that 39 people had something to locate in the dark that was not the edge. The clot came apart. The column walked again. And every person in it knew exactly what Brother Endoro was doing, and exactly what it cost him in exposure, and nobody said thank you, because you cannot thank someone for that while it is still happening. He talked for 3 hours. He was still talking when they reached the rockfall. That was when Locke changed the order of march, and that was when the fire started. You must understand the tactical problem, because it is beautiful and terrible, and there was no solution to it. The salamanders could see. Their autosenses ran on thermal, and in a 900-meter deep tunnel complex at 78 degrees, thermal is a poor picture, but it is a picture, except that a lictor's carapace does not simply hide it from the eye. It hides it from everything. The thing runs cold, or near enough, and it stands against hot rock. And even to a salamander's eyes, it is a shape that isn't there until it moves. But fire does not care what color you are. So Locke gave the order, and Brother Kajen brought up the heavy flamer. And from that point on, the march up out of the Deepworks was conducted by firelight. Every 30 or 40 meters, at every junction, at every side opening, Kajen would put a wash of burning promethium down the dark, and for the length of a heartbeat and a half, the tunnel would be daylight. That is where the horror of this story lives, and it is a very specific horror, and I want you to sit inside it with those miners for a moment. You are in absolute darkness, not dim, absolute. The lumen strings are dead. The Marines' lamps are off because light draws them, and you are being moved through a hot black tunnel by things you cannot see, holding the shoulder of the person in front of you. Your eyes have been fully dark adapted for hours. You are functionally blind and have accepted it. And then the world goes white. 100 cubic meters of burning promethium erupts down the tunnel ahead, and for 1.5 seconds you can see everything. The rock, the pipes, the faces of the people around you with their mouths open, and in that same 1.5 seconds, you see what the fire is for. You see the thing on the ceiling 40 meters up, unfolding out of a shape you had been looking straight at. 4 meters of glistening chitin coming down the roof toward the column, with its hooks already extended. You see it for 1.5 seconds, in perfect white detail, close enough to count the segments of it, and then the flame gutters out, and the dark comes back, and it comes back worse, because now your dark adaptation is gone, burned out by the flash, and you are more blind than you were before, and you are standing in a black tunnel in a ringing silence, with the after image of that thing floating on the inside of your eyelids, and you do not know where it is now. That is what those people did for 3 hours, blind, and then a second of unbearable revelation, and then blinder. 40 times, 50. Orla said afterward that the worst part was not seeing them. The worst part was the moment just before Kajen fired, the moment when you heard the hiss of the pilot flame catch, because in that instant you knew you were about to be shown something. Orla saw one properly at the 19th burst, and it is worth giving you her description rather than the Imperium's, because the Imperium's is a technical schedule, and hers is what a human being's eye actually does with the thing. She said it looked like the tunnel. That is the whole of it. And it took the scribe 3 attempts to get her to expand on it. And what she finally said was this, that in the white second of the flame, she had been looking directly at a section of pipe run and ribbed conduit on the left-hand wall, an ordinary bit of the Deepworks she had walked past 10,000 times, and that a piece of it had detached, not emerged from behind, not stepped out. A section of what her eyes had been reading as wall and pipe and shadow simply came away from the rest and was suddenly 4 meters of something folded, and it was already moving, and the part of it nearest her opened. She said the worst thing was not the talons or the size. It was that she had been looking at it for several seconds before it moved, with her eyes open, and had seen a wall. Every survivor who described one described that same order of events. I was looking at nothing. The nothing came apart. And the thing about that, the thing that got into them and stayed for 40 years, is that it retrains you. After the 19th burst, nobody in that column could look at a wall again. Every pipe run, every shadow, every irregular patch of rock became a thing that might be about to come apart. And there was no way to check, and there were 400 meters of tunnel left. And the only instrument any of them had for checking was a flamer that was killing them. And the fire was killing them. This is the second half of the trap, and it is the cruelest thing in this account. And the salamanders understood it before the miners did. A heavy flamer burns promethium. Promethium consumes oxygen, enormous amounts of it, far more than a body does. And they were in a sealed, unventilated 900-meter deep tunnel network, whose air supply had already been failing for 6 days. Every burst that saved them made the air worse. Kajen fired 41 times on that march. Somewhere around the 20th, the miners began to fail. It was gradual, and it looked like exhaustion at first. People slowing, stumbling, sitting down. Then a woman at the middle of the column simply lay down and could not be argued with. And Endoro picked her up, and then a man went down, and Endoro had no more arms. Orla, who had spent 19 years in ducts and knew more about bad air than anyone in that column, including the Astartes, worked it out around the 25th burst and went forward along the line, pushing past bodies in the dark, until she found the enormous shape of the sergeant. She had to shout at him twice before he heard her. "You have to stop burning it." Locke's helm turned down toward her, 2 red lenses in the black. "The flame is what is keeping them off the column. I know what it's doing. I'm a duct runner. I've been eating bad air since I was 12. Listen to me, please, listen. You've got 40 people in a dead tunnel and you're burning the air out of it faster than they can use it. They're not tired. They're drowning. Another hour of that and you'll carry us all out dead and you'll never have to fire a shot." There was a pause.
In the dark, somewhere back down the line, someone was coughing in the wet, rhythmic way that means the end of it. And Sergeant Locke said, and Orla remembered the exact words, because of how flat they were, and because she understood only later what they cost. "I know." She stared up at him. "I have known since the 9th burst," said Locke. "There is no other weapon that reveals them. If I do not burn, they take you from the line one at a time until there is no line. If I burn, the air goes and the weakest die first." The red lenses did not move.
"I am choosing which of you dies, duct runner. I have been choosing for an hour. Do you have a third option? I would take it. I would take it gladly." And Orla Vey, standing in a hot black tunnel with her hand on a giant's greave, understood the thing that this whole story exists to say. That these creatures had not come down here to be heroic and were not enjoying any part of it, and that the vow they had sworn had put them in a place where every single thing they did to protect her killed somebody, and that they were going to keep doing it anyway, all the way to the bottom, because the alternative was to start deciding that some people were acceptable to lose. "No," she said. "I don't have a third option." And then, because she was a duct runner, and it was the only thing she actually knew, she gave him what she had. "But you can make the burns worth more," she said. "You're firing at junctions. Stop. Fire at the returns, the sealing registers, the extract grills, the vertical runs. That's where they come from. every time. I've been watching it all night. They don't come along the tunnel, they come down out of the ducting. You fired 40 times, and about 30 of them were at empty tunnel. Burn the holes, not the corridor, and you'll spend a third of the air for the same result. There was a pause of perhaps 2 seconds. Then Locke said, on the open channel, to his whole squad, "Kajen, ceiling registers and vertical runs only. Cease horizontal suppression." And then, to her, in the same flat voice, "Say that to my brother at the front. Say it exactly as you said it to me." She did. She crawled up the column past 30 stumbling people in the dark and repeated it to an 8-foot warrior with a heavy flamer, who listened to a woman 1/3 his height for 11 seconds, and then said, "Understood," and changed how he was fighting. The burn rate dropped by better than half for the remaining hour. The Mechanicus reconstruction, years later, ran the atmospheric numbers on that tunnel and concluded that the change bought the column somewhere between 40 and 70 minutes of breathable air. Every person who came out of the number 6 extract came out on air that Orla Vey bought by opening her mouth to a monster. "Then go back to your father," said Locke, not unkindly, "and hold his head up. It helps." There is one more thing about the fire that has to be said, and it is the part Orla could never get anyone to understand afterward, because it sounds like ingratitude, and it is not. The salamanders were beautiful in it. That is the word she used, and she used it with her jaw set, daring the scribe to write it down. In the flash of a heavy flamer, in a black tunnel, an 8-foot warrior in drake green ceramite standing between you and something coming down the wall is the most magnificent thing a human being will ever see. And every single person in that column saw it 40 times, and it did not make them less afraid of him. That is the part nobody believes. You can see a thing save your life, repeatedly, at obvious cost to itself, and still flinch when it turns toward you. Because flinching is not a judgment, it is older than judgment. It happens in the spine. She said that by the second hour, she had started to be ashamed of it, that she would feel her body pull back when Brother Endoro came down the line to check on the stragglers, and she would hate herself for it, and it would happen again 90 seconds later. And she said that the salamanders knew and never once remarked on it, and kept their helms on after the bunker, all of them, the whole way up. She only worked out why the helms stayed on somewhere around the 40th burst, and it is the detail that finally broke her composure in that interview, 41 years later. They kept the helms on because they had all seen what happened in the cistern when Locke took his off. They were not hiding their faces to frighten the miners. They were hiding them to spare them. They lost 4 more in the next hour, 3 to the air. 1, a girl of about 11 near the front, holding a woman's hand, went straight up through a ceiling grill that Kajen had washed with flame 90 seconds earlier. And that was the moment the column stopped being controllable, because that was the moment 40 people understood that even the fire was not a guarantee. The column changed in that hour in a way that had nothing to do with the enemy, and this is the fealty horror in its purest and least comfortable form. They began to resent being saved. It started small, and it started, of course, with Hesh, because Hesh said out loud what everybody was doing arithmetic about privately. At the second rest, and the rests were the sergeant's idea, and they cost time nobody had, and Locke ordered them because people were dropping. Hesh sat with his back to the rock and said, to nobody, in the flat voice of a foreman reading a tally, 9 of us dead since the bunker. 9. In the bunker we were suffocating, but we were sat still. He wiped ash off his mouth. You want to know how long it takes to suffocate quietly in a sealed room? Longer than 3 hours. Longer than this. Nobody answered him. And the ugly thing, the thing Orla was ashamed of for 4 decades, is that a good number of them were doing that same sum. They had been alive in the bunker. The giants had opened the door, and now the column was being hunted and burned and marched. And the people who were dying outside, in the open, one at a time, on the move. There is a kind of animal in every human being that would rather die slowly in a place it knows than quickly in a place it does not. And that animal was speaking up all along the line. And here is the point. They were wrong. In the bunker, every one of them would have been dead in 9 hours, dead of the air, or opened up by a flesh hook coming through a ventilation register, the width of a dinner plate. Locke's decision was correct. It was correct at every stage. And correctness had nothing whatsoever to do with how it felt to be inside it. And the miners of the Deepworks spent that 3rd hour hating the things that were saving them, and several of them died still hating. That is what the sons of Vulcan actually sign up for, under the poetry. Not gratitude, this. They swear an oath that puts them, over and over, in the position of being resented by exactly the people they are dying for, and they know it in advance, and they swear it anyway. Brother Telvek died at the 3rd hour. He was the quiet one. He put himself into a side passage to cover a junction while the column crossed it, alone, and told Locke on the squad vox that it was clear, and then said in a completely level voice, "Correction," and then nothing. They found his helm 11 meters up a vertical vent, and the rest of him was never recovered, and Andoro had to be physically stopped from going up after it. Andoro stopped talking after Telvek. That was the only outward sign any of them gave, the whole night, that they were losing brothers. The left flank simply went quiet, and stayed quiet for 11 minutes, and then started again, in the same conversational voice, about a different nothing. Orla asked him about it, much later in the march, in one of the rests, because by then she had stopped being able to help herself. She asked whether they had known each other long, and Brother Andoro, 61 years old, said, 91 years. And then, after a moment, in exactly the same voice, "The seam on your left is dropping about 4 degrees. That means we are climbing. That is good. That is the other half of what those men were. And it is easy to miss under the fire and the black skin and the burning eyes. They grieved on a delay. They had learned over centuries to put it somewhere and pick it up later. And the reason they had learned it is that they are a chapter of 900 men who have been dying in small numbers in other people's tunnels for 10,000 years. And if they stopped for it, they would never start again. Andoro never did pick it up. There was no later. 6 salamanders now, 34 miners. And then, at the 4th hour, with the primary shaft 800 meters away, and everything still, just barely, possible, the roof of the number 2 transfer drift came down. It was not an attack. That is the thing Locke found hardest, afterward, in the little time he had for finding things hard. It was simply the cauldron, the deep heat working on stressed rock that had been holding up a hive for 400 years, and a section of the drift tunnel roof, the length of a gunship, let go and filled the tunnel wall to wall with 100,000 tons of basalt, sealing the main shaft, and every route to it. The column stood in the dark in front of it, and Urzan put a lamp on it, a real lamp, because there was no longer any point in not, and 40 people looked at a wall of rock where their way out had been. It was Orla who found the other way, because of course it was. She knew it was there before the dust had settled. She had cleared it 4 times in 19 years. And she said it out loud into the silence. And everyone turned, and the terrible weight of 40 pairs of eyes and 6 pairs of burning red lenses came onto a duct runner in an ash cloth. "There's a ventilation run," she said. "Number 6 primary extract. It goes from the pump hall right up past the shaft and comes out in the lower transit level. It's a straight run. No more than 300 meters. It'll take us out above the collapse. Locke said, "Dimensions." And all of they who had known this since the second she thought of it, and who had been trying for the last 400 meters to think of literally any way to be wrong, looked up at 8 feet of ceramite and drake scale and said, 60 centimeters, maybe 70 at the elbows. Nobody said anything. Even the miners understood, and they were dying on their feet. 60 centimeters. A salamander in power armor is a meter across the shoulders and cannot be made narrower by any means available to man. The only way out of the deep was a hole the giants could not fit through. Locke took 11 seconds. Orla counted them, without meaning to, the way you do. And in those 11 seconds he had to solve a problem that had no solution. And I want to lay it out one final time in its finished form, because this is the exact center of the story, and everything before it was approach, and everything after it is consequence. The vent saved the civilians and stranded the squad. Fine. The squad had never been the point, but the vent had a mouth, and the mouth was in a pump hall, and the pump hall was reachable, and there were between 4 and 9 organisms in these tunnels that had spent 5 days demonstrating an ability to reach 30 meters up a duct with a barbed line and take a body out of it. 34 people would be strung out along 300 meters of 60-centimeter pipe for the better part of 20 minutes, on their bellies, unable to turn, unable to defend, unable to move faster than the slowest one. The single most helpless formation a group of human beings can assume. If that pump hall was open behind them, the duct was not an escape route. It was a feeding tube. So the 60-centimeter hole did not present Locke with a choice between the civilians and the gatehouse. It presented him with a bill, and the bill was itemized. And it read, 18 minutes of a defended doorway, payable in Astartes. He could pay it and still make the gatehouse with 6 minutes to spare. He had run that number 3 times before he stood up. 6 minutes of margin, 34 people, 7 lives, 11 million, 1 crank, and a hole in a wall behind a cistern. That was the board. 11 seconds. Chapter 4. The Choke. They had 38 minutes. That was Locke's arithmetic, and he gave it to his brothers on the squad vox in 11 words while the miners were still staring at the rockfall, and none of the humans heard it, and it went like this. Gatehouse is 31 minutes back through the level 3 loop. Containment fails in 69. That is our entire margin. I want to lay the whole board out for you now, because everything from here is consequence, and consequence is only horrifying if you can see the shape of the thing. There were 4 ways to spend the next 69 minutes. The squad could take the ventilation run, except they could not. 60 centimeters. The squad could cut through the rockfall. Urzan ran the numbers on his melter and reported that they could burn through 100,000 tons of basalt in something over 4 hours, which was a courteous way of saying no. The squad could escort the civilians to the vent mouth, put them into it, and then run the level 3 loop to the gatehouse. 31 minutes of running, arriving with perhaps 6 minutes to spare, assuming the loop was clear, which it was not, because there were between 4 and 9 lictors in these tunnels, and every one of them now knew exactly where the last living humans in the Deepworks were standing. Or the squad could abandon the civilians at the rockfall, take the loop immediately, and be at the gatehouse in half the time, with a margin wide enough to survive a fight. 11 million people in the hive above, 34 in the tunnel. I have told you already what Locke chose, because I told you in the first chapter what these men are. But I want you to sit with the fact that it was a genuine choice, made by an intelligent man who was extremely good at his profession who could see the whole board, and who understood exactly what the fourth option was worth. He was not confused. He was not sentimental in the way that word is usually used. He simply belonged to the one chapter in the Imperium of man that has decided, as a matter of doctrine, that the moment you begin trading the people in front of you against the people you cannot see, you have already become the thing you are fighting, and that this remains true even when the arithmetic is against you, and that the arithmetic is always against you, and that this is precisely why the rule has to be absolute. The argument happened on the squad channel, and it lasted 40 seconds, and it was the only argument Locke's squad had that night. It was Kajan who made it, and it should be recorded properly, because the version of this story, where the salamanders are simply saintly, is a children's version, and does them no honor at all. Kajan was not a coward, and he was not cold. He had carried 2 of these people on his back for 3 hours. What he said, flatly, on the Vox, while 34 civilians stood in the dark 4 meters away, hearing nothing, was, "Sergeant, put them in the vent and leave. They are in the shaft either way. We do not change their odds by dying in that doorway. The things in these tunnels can climb, but they cannot fit either. 60 centimeters. The duct saves them or it doesn't, and we cannot affect it. Whereas the gatehouse we can affect. 11 million, Sergeant. We can still make the gatehouse." And the terrible thing is that Kajan was very nearly right. That is the part that has to be said. His reasoning was sound, and his numbers were sound, and every chapter in the Adeptus Astartes except one would have acted on it without a second's hesitation, and been correct too. What Locke said back, and Endoro repeated it later on the open channel where the survivors' Vox beads picked it up, which is the only reason it exists in the record, was, "They cannot fit." Agreed. But they can reach 30 meters up a 60-centimeter duct with a flesh hook, brother, and they can do it from the pump hall, and there are 300 meters of it. If we leave that room open behind them, they will empty it from the bottom like a jar. A pause of perhaps 2 seconds. That is the answer to your tactical question. Here is the answer to your real one. If we go now, we reach the gates with 20 minutes to spare instead of 6. We would spend those 14 minutes on nothing, and they would cost 34 people who are standing 4 meters from me and who have been listening to us breathe for 3 hours. Sergeant, 14 minutes, Kajan. That is the whole price. We are not choosing between 11 million and 34. We are choosing between 34 and a comfortable margin. Then quieter, and if the margin is what it takes, I will run the loop with my arm off and turn the cranks with my teeth. Get them into the vent. That, precisely, is the Promethean creed as it is actually practiced, and it is not what people think it is. It is not the belief that 34 is worth more than 11 million. Locke knew exactly what those numbers were. It is the belief that a man does not get to spend the people in front of him to buy himself comfort. That the margin, the safety, the sensible reserve, the reasonable precaution is exactly the thing you are obliged to burn first, and that you keep burning it until there is nothing left but your own body, and then you burn that. Kajan said, "Understood," and he did not raise it again, and 11 minutes later he stood in a doorway with a heavy flamer and did not move from the spot until he died on it. Endoro, Kajan, get them into the vent. Sergeant, Kajan, get them into the vent. There is a version of this moment that gets told in the hive schools of the Imperium, and in that version the Space Marine makes a decision and the mortals are moved by it. What actually happened at that rockfall was closer to a riot. They had understood, most of them, before Locke said a word. You do not need to be a tactician to grasp the hole is 60 centimeters and the giants are a meter across. It is a fact you can see with your eyes, and 34 exhausted people saw it at the same time and reacted the way exhausted people do. Somebody started shouting that they were being abandoned. Somebody else, and this is the one that stayed with Orla, started shouting the opposite, that the Marines had to come, that there had to be a way, that they could take the armor off. And that spread, because it was the most bearable idea in the room. Take the armor off and come with us. Half a dozen people took it up at once, pleading with 8-foot warriors to strip and crawl. They could not. It is not a matter of will, and it is not a matter of time. A Space Marine's power armor is not a suit he is wearing. It is bolted into the black carapace grafted under his ribs, connected at the spine, and a battle brother out of his plate in the field is a man who has had part of himself removed. And even out of it, he is 2.5 meters of transhuman muscle and reinforced bone. Andoro's shoulders alone would not have entered that duct. Locke let them shout for perhaps 20 seconds. Then he said, at a volume that stopped the hall, "We cannot fit. If we could, we would. There is no arrangement of this in which we come with you." And then, because he was Locke, and because arithmetic was the only comfort he had ever been any good at giving, "It does not matter. You do not need us in the shaft. You need us behind you, at the bottom of it, for 18 minutes. That is the whole of the problem, and it is a problem we can solve." Hesh said, in a voice gone strange, "And after the 18 minutes?" And Locke, who had 4 lictors and a magma bleed and no margin, and had already worked out precisely what was going to happen to him, said, "After the 18 minutes, you will be on the transit level, and this will not be your concern." The pump hall was 200 meters back, and it took 11 minutes to move 34 failing people that far. And the whole way, Orla could hear the Salamanders' Vox speakers clicking as they talked to each other on a channel she could not hear, and she understood from the rhythm of it that they were arguing, and that the arguing had stopped. The vent mouth was a rectangular hole in the wall of the pump hall, a meter off the floor, 60 centimeters by 90, with the grill already gone because Orla had personally unbolted it 8 years ago and never got round to putting it back. It was the least dramatic-looking object in this entire story. It was a hole in a wall behind a cistern, and Locke crouched down in front of it and put one gauntleted hand flat against the rockcrete beside it. And Orla, who was standing right there, who had to be, because she was the only one who knew the route, watched an 8-foot warrior of the Adeptus Astartes measure a hole he could not fit through and hold perfectly still for about 2 seconds. Then he stood up and turned around, and he did the thing that 34 people would talk about for the rest of their lives. He took his helm off again, and he crouched down, and he addressed a group of dying miners as though they were a war council. "Listen, there is a shaft behind me that goes up past the collapse and comes out on the transit level. From there, the stair to the surface is signposted, and I am told it is walkable. We cannot follow you. Our armor will not pass, and we cannot remove it. It is bolted into our spines." He let that sit. "Beyond that hole, we cannot help you. There is nothing waiting to carry you. Whatever is in that shaft, you meet alone." Somebody was crying. He waited for them to finish, and then he said, "This woman knows the route." He looked at Orla, and there was nothing performative in it at all. "You will do exactly what she says. She is your sergeant now. Do you understand me?" 34 people looked at a duct runner in an ashcloth. "Yes," said Hesh, the foreman, before anyone else could not say it. "Yes, we understand." "Good." Locke put his helm back on. "Go now. Do not stop for sound behind you. Whatever you hear behind you, keep climbing." And then, because he was a son of Vulcan, and there was one thing left that he could give, He did the small thing that outlives all the rest of it. There was a boy in that column, about 9, called Pell, whose mother had gone up through a ceiling grill 2 hours earlier and who had not made a sound since. He had been carried and then walked and then carried again, and he had not made one sound. And as the line began to go into the vent, Brother Andoro, the youngest, the one who had carried children under his arm all night, stopped in front of that boy and went down on one knee and worked something off the fastening of his own belt and pressed it into the child's hands. It was a small hammer, 12 centimeters, a votive piece, the kind every salamander forges as an apprentice and carries for the rest of his life. Andoro had made it at 14 years old, on an anvil on Nocturne, and it was the only object in the galaxy that was truly his, and it had been on his belt for 61 years. He did not make a speech. He said, "Hold this, it does not burn." And then he stood up and went to the choke point, and Pell never saw him again. Nobody has ever been able to say why he did it. And Orla, who saw it from 2 meters away, waiting at the vent mouth, spent 40 years turning it over. It was not a keepsake. The child did not know him and would never learn his name. It was not a blessing. Salamanders do not bless. Her best answer in the end was the simplest one. Every son of Vulcan is a smith before he is a soldier, and a smith's whole understanding of the world is that a made thing outlasts the hand that made it. Andoro had 18 minutes left, and one object in the galaxy that was truly his, forged at 14 on an anvil on a burning world, and he was about to be erased along with everything else in that pump hall. No body recovered, no gene seed, no name in any record, nothing. So he gave the hammer to the smallest person going up the shaft, not as comfort, as survival, the only kind available to him. A thing he had made with his hands, going up a duct in a 9-year-old's fist, out of a hole in the ground that was about to close forever. It worked. That is the remarkable part. The chapter lost 7 brothers on Kolvath, and has no record of their deaths, and never recovered a scrap of them. And a 12-centimeter votive hammer forged by a boy on Nocturne is still, as far as anyone knows, somewhere out there in the Imperium, being handed down by people who have no idea what it is. Loading them took 11 of the 18 minutes, and it was the ugliest thing that happened in the Deepworks that did not involve the enemy. You cannot put 34 terrified, oxygen-starved people into a 60-centimeter hole quickly. The mouth was a meter off the floor. Each person had to be lifted, turned onto their belly, and fed in head first, and then had to keep going, immediately, without pause, because the next one was already coming in behind them, and there is no room in a duct to hesitate. 3 of them could not do it. Not would not, could not. The body simply refused, the way a body refuses a great height, and they thrashed and fought and had to be pulled back out, and one man broke a finger against the duct lip getting himself out, and stood in the pump hall shaking and saying, "I can't, I can't, I can't," over and over. Brother Andoro fixed that. He crouched in front of each of them in turn and said the same 3 sentences. It is 300 meters. It goes up. At the end there is a stair and sky. And then he lifted them and put them in, gently, and held their ankles for the first meter so they had something to push against and let go. All 3 went. 2 of them lived. There was a woman with an infant. I have not mentioned her before because for 3 hours the child had been silent, and Orla had assumed, as everyone had assumed, that it was dead. It was not. It was 4 months old, and it had been quiet the whole night in the way that oxygen-starved infants are quiet, and the woman would not go into the duct because she had worked out, correctly and faster than anyone else in that hall, that a person cannot inchworm up 300 meters of duct on their elbows while holding a baby. Shakor solved it. He took his own drake-scale cloak off his pauldron, and he cut it with a combat blade into a sling, and he bound the infant to the woman's back with a knot he tied one-handed while holding a thunder hammer in the other, and the whole business took perhaps 40 seconds, and the woman looked up into his black face with her mouth open, and did not thank him because she could not speak, and she went into the duct, and the child lived. It lived a long time, in fact, and had children of its own, and none of them ever knew that they existed because an 8-foot warrior of the Adeptus Astartes cut up an heirloom on a 9-minute clock. Hesh went second to last of the able men, and he stopped at the vent mouth and turned round in it, which nobody else did, and looked back into the pump hall at the 6 of them forming their line across the north doorway. "Is there anything," he said, "anything at all, any of us, anything we can do?" Locke did not turn round. He said, "Climb." They went into the vent. Orla first, because she had to lead. Her father third, pushed and dragged by Hesh behind him, because a man with no lungs cannot crawl uphill, and had to be moved up 300 meters of 60-centimeter duct by main force. And I will let you sit with that image for a moment, because Orla Vey sat with it for 40 years. Orla was the last thing Locke said anything to. She had gone in first and then come back out, climbed 12 meters up the duct, established that the grade and the joins were as she remembered, and reversed the whole way down again on her elbows to report it, which took 4 minutes she did not have, and which she did because she was not going to lead 33 people into a shaft she had not checked. When she dropped out of the vent mouth onto the pump hall floor, she found the sergeant standing over her, and she was too tired to be frightened, which is the only reason the conversation happened at all. "It's clear to the first bend," she said. "After that, I'm going on 19-year-old memory." "Understood." She stood there a moment, ashcloth, 1 meter 55, 60 kilos, in front of a wall of drake green ceramite, and she asked him the question she had been carrying since the bunker, and she asked it badly, because there is no good way to ask it. "Why us?" she said. 11 million up there, 41 of us. You did the sums. I've watched you do them all night. Why us?" And Sergeant Locke looked down at a duct runner in a doorway with 6 minutes left, and gave the only piece of theology he ever offered anybody, and it was, as usual, 4 sentences long. "Because the 11 million are a number," he said. "You are not. I have never once been able to make my hands work for a number." He paused, and the Vox grill clicked. "My Primarch was found as an infant on a burning world by a smith and his wife, who had nothing, and who took him in. Everything my chapter is comes out of 2 people, who did an unreasonable thing for 1 child in front of them." Another click. "We are not clever, duct runner. We are just very hard to talk out of it." Then he said, "Climb," and turned away. And that was the last conversation Orla Vey had with him, and she thought about it, by her own account, nearly every day for 41 years. And behind them, in the pump hall, 6 salamanders formed a line across a doorway 9 meters wide. The choke point was the pump hall's north entrance, and it was the only way into the hall that was not a hole in a wall, and it was where Locke had chosen to spend everything he had left. There is no drama in why. It was the narrowest defensible ground between the enemy and the vent mouth, and the vent mouth needed 18 minutes to empty, and 6 Astartes standing across 9 meters of doorway is a thing that takes a very long time to remove. They did not make speeches. Locke's chapter does not. Their creed is spoken over an anvil once, at the start, and after that it is considered to have been said. What passed between them on the squad vox in the last 90 seconds before it came was, in its entirety, Urzan. "Sergeant, the gates." Locke. "I know." Urzan. 11 million. Locke. "I know, brother." A pause of about 4 seconds. Urzan. into the fires, and the other 5 on the Vox, quietly, not in unison, the way men say a thing they have said 10,000 times, unto the anvil. They spent the 4 minutes they had preparing the ground, and the preparation is worth describing because it is the last thing these men did as craftsmen, and craft was what they were. They did not simply stand in the doorway. Urazan cut the pump hall's 2 cisterns open with his melter at the base so that the standing water, 40,000 liters of it, brackish and warm, flooded out across the hall floor to a depth of perhaps 6 centimeters, which does nothing to a lictor, but does a great deal to a burning promethium spill, keeping the fire in front of the line instead of under it. Shah-Khor dragged the stripped pump housings, 4 tons apiece, off their mountings and jammed them into the doorway's flanks, narrowing 9 meters to 6 and denying the angles. Ndoro laid out Kajen's spare fuel canisters in a line behind the position where a man could reach them without turning his head, and then went along the line and set every brother's failing armor seal himself, one at a time, because he was the youngest and it was his place to serve, and because it gave the others 4 minutes of not thinking. And Locke walked the line and put his hand flat on each of their breastplates, which is a Nocturnian thing, and older than the chapter, and means roughly the anvil holds. He did it without a word, 6 times. It took perhaps 20 seconds. Then Shah-Khor set his thunderhammer's head down on the rockcrete and leaned on the haft and said, on the open channel where the sergeant could hear him, 18 minutes, Sergeant. 18. That's a long time to hold a door. Yes. Good, said Shah-Khor. And that is the entirety of what the sons of Vulcan said to one another before the end. No oratory, no exhortation. Their chapter believes that a vow spoken once over an anvil at the age of 15 is a vow spoken, and that repeating it in the last 4 minutes is a thing men do to convince themselves, and that a man who needs convincing at the doorway should not have come down the stair. So they checked their seals, and they narrowed the ground, and one man made a small dry joke about how long a door is, and another man said good, and that was all. The last 4 minutes are worth one more paragraph, because of what the survivors were doing during them. They were, at that moment, between 40 and 90 meters up the duct, far enough that the pump hall was a rectangle of dim orange behind and below them, close enough that they could still hear the 6 of them moving down there. And every account agrees on what that sounded like. Nothing much. Metal on rockcrete. A pump housing being dragged. Someone checking a seal. The mundane, unhurried workshop noises of men getting a job ready. Orla said that was the moment it finally landed on her. Not at the bunker, not at the rockfall, but 90 meters up a duct, listening to 6 enormous creatures calmly rearranging furniture in a room they had all agreed to die in. She said there was no fear in the sound at all. She said it sounded like her father's shift getting the drift face ready in the morning. They came at the 4th minute. Chapter 5. The price of Promethean mercy. There is no true account of what happened in the pump hall, because everyone who was in the room died in it. What exists is a reconstruction, assembled afterward by an Adeptus Mechanicus survey team, from wall scoring and residue analysis and the recovered Vox log, and what the survivors heard through 300 meters of ventilation duct. So I will give you both. That is how this chapter has to be told. The fury and the terror at the same time. Because the whole point of these 7 men is that those 2 things were happening in the same building and were the same event. Start with the vent. 34 people in a 60-centimeter duct, on their bellies, in absolute darkness, climbing. That is the physical reality, and it is worse than it sounds. There is no crawling on hands and knees in a 60-centimeter duct. There is inchworming, elbow and hip, with the rock 10 centimeters above the back of your skull. You cannot turn around. You cannot pass anyone. If the person in front of you stops, the entire column stops, and the person behind you cannot get past to help. And everyone in the line understands within about 90 seconds that they are now in a single organism that moves at the speed of its weakest part, and that they are inside it, and that they cannot get out. Orla went first with her hands out ahead of her, reading the duct by feel, the join lines, the change in the grade, the burr on a bad weld she remembered from 8 years back. And behind her the sound of 33 people dragging themselves up a metal throat, and behind that, 300 meters and one wall away, the pump hall. Now the hall. They came in a wave. That is the detail the Mechanicus reconstruction was clearest on, and the one that surprised the Tactici. Because lictors are ambush organisms. They do not mass. They do not charge. They hunt alone. On Kolvath, at the 4th minute, between 4 and 9 of them came through the north entrance in a single coordinated rush, and the assessment afterward was that the hive mind had simply changed the parameters, that these organisms had gathered everything they had come for, that the survey was complete, and that what remained in the pump hall was no longer prey to be harvested, but an obstruction to be cleared. 6 salamanders across 9 meters. Karjen fired first and did not stop firing for 4 minutes, which is longer than a heavy flamer's fuel is rated for, and the residue analysis found the Promethean burn saturating 110 meters of tunnel beyond the doorway. In the vent, the survivors felt it before they heard it. A pressure change, a hot wind coming up the duct from behind them, and then the sound, a vast tearing roar that went on, and then the roar stopped, and the other sounds started. I am going to be careful here, because I could make this magnificent, and it was not magnificent. Here is the whole of it, from the reconstruction. Brother Kajen died at the 6th minute, when the flamer ran dry, and he was killed with the empty weapon still in his hands, and the wall behind him showed he had not moved from the spot he was standing on when the fight began. Brother Urzan died at the 8th, and took a lictor with him, and the melter discharge that did it took the ceiling down across the north entrance, and narrowed the doorway from 9 meters to 4. That collapse is the single reason the vent had time to empty. Urzan did it on purpose. The Vox log records him saying immediately before, "Sergeant, move left," and nothing else. Brother Endoro, the youngest, 61 years old, who had carried children all night and given away his hammer, held the narrowed doorway alone for 110 seconds, while Locke and Shakor dragged Karjen's body clear of the firing line. Because salamanders do that, because it is doctrine, and it is also simply what they are, and those 110 seconds are the most expensive thing anyone spent on Kolvath. He was still standing when they got back. He died at the 11th minute. I have said there is no true account of the pump hall, and there isn't. But the Mechanicus survey did establish one thing about that fight beyond argument, and it is the thing I would put on the memorial these men never got. They did not give ground. Wall scoring is a crude instrument, but it is an honest one. It tells you where a body stood, and how long it stood there, and which way it was facing. And the pattern the surveyors recovered from the pump hall was not a fighting withdrawal. It was 6 positions, in a line across a doorway, and every one of them was still on, or within half a meter of where it had begun. Kajen died on his mark. Urzan died forward of his, which is a different failure. Endoro's position showed the deepest scoring in the hall. 110 seconds of one man alone in a 4-meter gap, and the marks of it go up the walls to a height of 3 meters, and there are gouges in the ceiling. Astartes are not built to hold ground. That is worth understanding. Their entire doctrine, 10,000 years of it, is speed and shock and the deep strike. You hit, you break, you move, and a space marine standing still in a doorway is a space marine being used badly. Every tactical instinct these men had was screaming at them to maneuver, and there was nowhere to maneuver to, because behind them was a hole in a wall with people crawling up it. So they did the thing they were worst at for 18 minutes, on purpose. 6 of the finest shock troops in human history stood absolutely still in a doorway and were killed one at a time in the dark, because that was what the vow required, and there is no glory in it, and it is not what any of them were made for. And I think it is the bravest thing in this entire archive. And in the duct, 300 meters up and 1 wall away, 34 people heard all of it. That is the horror I want to leave you with, more than the fury, the listening. Because sound travels beautifully in a ventilation system. It is a system designed to move air, and sound is a thing air does. And the number 6 primary extract carried the pump hall up to them with awful fidelity. They heard the flamer. They heard the flamer stop. They heard the impacts, which were enormous and irregular, like a foundry running badly. They heard, twice, a space marine make a sound, and both times it was very short. They heard the wet parts, and they could not stop, and they could not turn around, and they could not put their hands over their ears, because their hands were what they were climbing with. And so 34 human beings inched up a black metal throat for 18 minutes, listening to 7 strangers be killed for them, one at a time, directly beneath their bodies. Pell, the boy of 9, made his first sound of the night about 12 minutes into the climb. He said, "They're still fighting." He said it the way you'd report weather. Nobody answered him. He said it 4 more times over the next 6 minutes, at intervals, in the same flat little voice, into a duct where 33 people were climbing, and nobody had the breath to reply. They're still fighting. And then, at around the 18th minute, he stopped saying it, and Orla, 9 bodies ahead of him, and unable to turn round, understood exactly what the stopping meant, and kept climbing and did not ask. That is what those 18 minutes were, from inside the shaft. A 9-year-old boy with a hammer in his fist, keeping the count for everybody, until there was nothing left to count. Qassem Vey died in the duct at the 14th minute, 4 meters behind his daughter, of a heart that had had enough, quietly, while Hesh was pushing him. Orla knew before Hesh said anything. There is a rhythm to the person behind you, and it changed. And there was no room to turn around, and no way to reach him, and nothing to be done. And she has never been able to describe to anyone what it is like to be told your father has died 4 meters behind you, in a place where you cannot go to him, in the dark, with the sound of the pump hall coming up underneath, and to have 31 people behind him who cannot get past. Hesh said, "Orla, I have to move him." And Orla Vey said, "Move him," and kept climbing, and that is the price of the ticket out of the Deepworks, and it was paid by everyone in that duct in their own coin. Shakor died at the 15th minute. He had a thunder hammer, and the reconstruction found the marks of it across 4 meters of wall and floor. And the surveyors reported, in the dry language of their trade, evidence of sustained close-quarters engagement at a static point, which means he did not take 1 step backward in 7 minutes. At the 17th minute, the vent mouth stopped taking people, because the last of them was through, 31, out of the 41 who had been in the cistern bunker, out of the 34 who had stood at the rockfall, and Brother Hakon, who I have not named until now because he was a quiet man who spent the whole night on rearguard, and this is his only line in the account, put his hand on his sergeant's pauldron and said, on the Vox. Empty. Go. And Locke went. He went because the gates were still open, and 11 million people were still over his head, and there were 40 minutes left on the containment. He went through the pump hall's south service door, with 2 lictors coming after him, and Hakon standing in the north doorway alone to make sure only 2 did. And he ran the level 3 loop, 1,400 meters of maintenance tunnel in the dark, wounded, with his right arm not working. And he reached the gatehouse at the base of the primary shaft, with 9 minutes to spare. And he closed the deep blast gates of Kolvath by hand, one at a time, with a manual actuator crank designed for a work gang of 6. 4 gates, 9 minutes. He got them all. And the pressure went sideways into the dead galleries exactly as the Mechanicus had predicted. And Hive Vantor did not become a chimney. And 11 million people who never learned any of this went on with their lives. Now here is the last of it. And it is the part that makes this a story and not a report. The blast gates capped the vent, but the fire had to go somewhere, and the deep galleries were not sealed from everything. There was one route left open between the magma bleed and the upper works, and it was the number 6 primary extract. The ventilation run, the 60-centimeter duct with 31 people still in it, and its lower mouth open in a pump hall that was about to fill with molten rock. There was a gate on it. There is a gate on every extract run. It is a fire measure, and it is 400 years old, and it seals the duct at the pump hall end. And its actuator was on the inside. Locke worked it out on the gatehouse aspects, with 7 minutes left, and there was nobody in the Deepworks to send, because everybody he had was dead, and he went back. He ran the loop the other way, with the magma bleed already coming up behind him in the low galleries, and he arrived in the pump hall, which by then, the reconstruction says, was at 400 degrees and rising, and he found the extract gate and the manual seal, and he found, standing between him and it, the last 2 lictors in the Deepworks, which had not left, because the hive mind had made the same calculation he had about where the survivors were. There is no reconstruction of that. The wall scoring simply ends. Whatever happened in the pump hall in the last 4 minutes of Sergeant Locke's life happened in the dark at 400 degrees between 1 wounded man and 2 organisms grown specifically to kill things like him. And there is no Vox log, because his Vox had failed an hour earlier, and there is no witness, because everyone was dead or 300 meters up a duct. What is known is this. The gate was sealed. It was sealed from the inside, manually, with the crank turned down and locked, which takes about 40 seconds in both hands, and 31 people in a ventilation duct 300 meters above felt the whole shaft shudder, and then felt the heat that had been coming up behind them stop coming, and then heard, through the metal, faintly, from very far below, one long grinding shriek of a mechanism being forced, and then nothing at all. Nobody in that duct knew that Locke had lived. That is the thing that shaped the rest of all their lives, and it is worth being precise about it. From inside the number 6 primary extract, the sequence was a very long noise, and then a shorter noise, and then silence, and then, much later, after they had stopped expecting anything, the shudder, the heat stopping, and that single grinding shriek from far below. 31 people made their own account of what that last sound was, privately, in the dark, and none of them ever compared notes, and most of them got it wrong. Orla got it right. She was a duct runner. She had spent 19 years listening to mechanisms in ventilation systems, and she knew the sound of a fire gate crank being forced past its stop, and she knew there was only one of those between them and the pump hall, and she knew it could only be turned from below. So she was the only person in that shaft who understood, in the moment it happened, that one of them had come back. That one of them had run a burning tunnel with the magma already rising, and had got to the gate, and had turned the crank, and had locked it, and that the locking of it was the sound of a door being shut with a man on the wrong side. She did not tell the others. She has said that she does not know why, that she has thought about it for 4 decades, and the best she can manage is that they were all still climbing, and that there was nothing anybody could do with the information except carry it, and that she was already carrying her father 4 meters behind her, and did not think the column could take one more thing. She told them at the top, on the surface, in the ash, when they had stopped. And that is when the weeping started. Not at the sky, not at survival, at that. They came out onto the lower transit level at the 51st minute, and Orlave led them up the signposted stair, 31 people, and it took them 4 hours. And at some point in the 3rd hour, the ash lights started coming down from above, and they began to understand what it was. The last 400 meters of that stair took an hour and a half, and it took that long because of a thing nobody had anticipated. They would not leave anyone. 3 people could not walk by then, and 31, exhausted, oxygen poisoned, grief-stupid miners, several of whom had spent the 3rd hour of the march resenting the giants for exactly this, stopped and organized themselves and carried them. Hesh rigged drag slings out of ashcloth. They rotated in 4s. It cost them an hour they had no reason to think they had, on a stair, above a magma bleed, with no guarantee the gates had held. Orla never made anything of it in the interview, and the scribe did not ask. But it is the only inheritance in this account, and I would not have you miss it. 7 creatures came out of the dark and refused, at the cost of every one of their lives, to leave anybody behind. And 8 hours later, at the top of a stair, 31 terrified civilians who had been frightened of them the entire time did precisely the same thing, without discussing it, as though it were obvious. That is how the Promethean creed actually propagates, not by preaching. Nobody preached at them. Locke's total recorded oratory that night runs to about 9 sentences. It propagates the way a fire is passed, by one thing burning next to another thing until the second thing catches. They came out onto the surface of Kolvath, into a grey dawn with the ash falling, and it was the first sky most of them had seen in 11 days, and the first sky some of them had seen in years, and they stood in it and did not cheer. I want to be exact about that. There was no cheering. There was no weeping at first either. What the survey team found, when they came up the apron to collect them, was 31 people standing in the falling ash, in absolute silence, most of them not looking at anything, several of them still holding onto the shoulder of the person in front of them, because nobody had told them to let go. They were debriefed for 2 days. They were given a form of words about heretical industrial sabotage, and told that the matter was closed. The 7 salamanders were logged as casualties sustained during recovery operations. Deepworks, Kolvath and their gene seed was never recovered, because nobody went down there again. The deep levels of Hive Vantor were sealed permanently and are sealed to this day. No commendation was issued, because chapters like theirs do not petition for them, and the administratum does not offer. 11 million people were saved, and there is no monument, and there is not one line anywhere in the Imperium's records connecting those 11 million lives to 7 men who held a doorway. And there is one more thing in the record, and it is the coldest thing in this whole account, and I have held it until now because it is what makes Kolvath a grimdark story rather than a heroic one. 7 salamanders died in the Deepworks to keep a magma bleed out of Hive Vantor, and they succeeded, and 11 million people lived. For 9 years. because there had been lictors in those tunnels. And a lictor is not a monster that wandered in. A lictor is a survey instrument sent ahead, and everything it takes it reads, and everything it reads goes home. 4,000 workers went into those cocoons, and every one of them was a report. The hive fleet that had dispatched them arrived in the Kolvath system 9 years and 4 months after the night in the pump hall, and it came knowing the shape of the crust and the depth of the shafts and the layout of the hive and the location of every water reclamation plant, because it had been told in detail by 4,000 people who did not know they were talking. Kolvath is a dead rock now. There is no hive Vantor. There is nothing there at all. So, did it matter? That is the question this story is standing on, and I am not going to answer it for you, but I will tell you how the people who were actually there answered it. Orlave was asked at the end of that interview whether she thought the salamanders had died for nothing, given what came afterward. And she looked at the scribe for a long moment and said, 9 years. My father died in that duct, so he got none of it. But Pel got 9 years. The baby in the cloak got 9 years and had a child of her own in them. 31 of us got 9 years, and one of us got 41, because they got off Kolvath before it came. And then she said the thing the scribe underlined, twice, in a file nobody read for a century. You're asking me whether it was worth it because it didn't last. Nothing lasts. Not out here. The hive was always going to go, and Kolvath was always going to go, and I am going to go, and so will everything anyone has ever built anywhere. If a thing only counts when it lasts, then nothing anybody has ever done counts, and I don't accept that, and neither did they. They didn't come down there to save Kolvath. They came down there to get those people, that night, out of that room. And they did it. It's the only thing in my whole life I've ever seen done completely. That is the Promethean creed with the poetry stripped off it. It is not a belief that mercy wins. Vulcan's sons have been at this for 10,000 years, and they know perfectly well that it does not win. It is a belief that the arithmetic of did it last is a coward's arithmetic, that the only question is whether the people in front of you got out of the room, and that a galaxy which is going to end everything regardless is precisely the galaxy in which somebody has to keep standing in the doorway anyway. Orlave lived another 41 years. She never went back underground. She could not, in the end, tolerate enclosed spaces at all, which for a duct runner is a particular kind of joke, and she made her living above ground doing work she hated, and she raised the boy, Pel, whose mother had gone up through a ceiling grill because somebody had to. She talked about it exactly once, to an administratum scribe, and most of what you have heard comes from that record. And at the end of it, the scribe asked her the question they always ask, the one that is supposed to have an easy answer. What would you like recorded about the angels of the Emperor who saved you? And Orlave thought about it for a long time, and then she said that I was afraid of them the whole time, right to the end. When he crouched down and told us his mother's name, I was still afraid of him. I want that written down because everyone tells it wrong afterward. They say we were comforted, and we were not comforted. We were terrified. We were terrified of the black faces and the red eyes and the heat coming off them. We were terrified of the fire. We were terrified of what they were, all the way up. And they knew. That's the thing. He knew exactly what we saw when we looked at him. He took his helmet off anyway. He told us his mother's name anyway. He carried my father anyway. He held that door for 18 minutes for people who were flinching away from him the entire night. And he went back into it for a duct gate he couldn't have known any of us would live long enough to use. They didn't do it because we loved them. Nobody loved them. They did it because of what they are. She stopped. Then she said the last thing, and the scribe did write it down. And it is the only sentence out of the whole Kolvath incident that ever escaped the archive. Everything else down there wanted something from us. They were the only ones that didn't. The boy, Pell, kept the hammer. 12 centimeters, forged by a 14-year-old on a burning world, carried 61 years on a warrior's belt, and pressed into the hands of a 9-year-old in a pump hall with 18 minutes left. He had it his whole life. He never learned the name of the man who gave it to him. He was 9, and no one asked, and there was no one left to ask. And so the object outlived the name, which is, in the end, what happens to almost everything in the Imperium of man.